of the room behind the closed door and the mystery of the garden behind the big wall. Mrs. Phelps was stunned. "Exactly how old are you, Matilda?" she asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phelps was more stunned than ever, but she had the sense not to show it. "What sort of book would you like to read next?" she asked. Matilda said, "I would like a really good one that grown-ups read, a famous one. I don't know any names." Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown-up book for a 4-year-old girl? Her first thought was to pick a young teenager's romance of the kind that is written for 15-year-old schoolgirls, but for some reason she found herself instinctively walking past that particular shelf. "Try this," she said. "It's a very famous and very good. If it's too long for you, you can let me know, and I'll find something shorter and a bit easier." "Great Expectations," Matilda read, "by Charles Dickens. I'd love to try it." "I must be mad," Mrs. Phelps told herself, but to Matilda she said, "Of course you may try it." Over the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting in for hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room, with a book on her lap. It was necessary to rest it on the lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up. I'll show you the picture before I flip the page. Which meant she had to sit forward or leaning forward in order to read. And a strange sight it was. This tiny dark-haired person sitting there with her feet nowhere touching the floor, totally absorbed in the wonderful adventures of Pip and old Miss Havisham in her cobweb house, and by the spell of magic that Dickens, the great storyteller, had woven with his words. The only movement from the reader was the lifting of the hands every now and then to turn over a page. And Mrs. Phelps always felt sad when the time came for her to cross the floor and say, "It's 10 to 5, Matilda." During the first week of Matilda's visits, Mrs. Phelps had said to her, "Does your mother walk you down here every day and then take you home?" "My mother goes to Aylesbury every afternoon to play bingo," Matilda said. "She doesn't know I come here." "But that's surely not right," Mrs. Phelps said. "I think you'd better go ask her." "I'd rather not," Matilda said. "She doesn't encourage reading books, nor does my father." "But why do they expect you to do every afternoon in an empty house?" "Just mooch around mostly and watch the telly." "I see. She doesn't really care what I do," Matilda said, a little sadly. Mrs. Phelps was concerned about the child's safety on the walk through the fairly busy village high street and the crossing of the roads, but decided not to interfere. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which in the edition contained 411 pages. "I loved it," she said to Mrs. Phelps. "Has Mr. Dickens written any others?" "A great number," she said, astounded Mrs. Phelps. "Shall I choose you another?" I'll take a picture before I flip it. Over the next 6 months, under Mrs. Phelps' watchful and compassionate eye, Matilda read the following books: Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Tess d'Urberville by Thomas Hardy, Gone to Earth by Mary Webb, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, The Good Companions by J.B. Priestley, Brighton Rock by Graham Greene, and Animal Farm by George Orwell. It was a formidable list, and by now Mrs. Phelps was filled with wonder and excitement. But it was probably a good thing that she did not allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Almost anyone else, witnessing the achievements of the small child, would have been tempted to make a great fuss and shout the news all over the village and beyond. But not so Mrs. Phelps. She was someone who minded her own business, and had long since discovered it was seldom worthwhile to interfere with other people's children. Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her, especially about men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way he tells it, I feel I am right there on the spot, watching it happen. A fine writer will always make you feel that, Mrs. Phelps said. And don't worry about the bits you don't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash over you like music. I will. Did you know, Mrs. Phelps said, that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home? I didn't know that, Matilda said. Could I do it? Of course, said Mrs. Phelps. When you have chosen the book you want, bring it to me so I can make a note of it, and then it's yours for 2 weeks. You can take more than one if you wish. Put him over here in a spot. There we go. Okay. Here's a picture of Mrs. Phelps. From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read most afternoons, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. She was quite tall enough to reach things around the kitchen, but she kept a small box in the outhouse, which she brought in and stood on in order to get whatever she wanted. Mostly, it was hot chocolate she made, warming the milk in the saucepan on the stove before mixing it. Occasionally, she made Bovril or Ovaltine. It was pleasant to take a hot drink up to her room and have it beside her as she sat in her silent room reading in the empty house in most afternoons. The books transported her into new worlds. It introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway, and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She traveled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. So that ends chapter 1. We're going to read chapter 2 next.